When Chinese characters appear next to Pinyin, the familiar letters distract us from the characters. Wouldn't it be nice if we could keep information about the tones, but throw Pinyin away? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about tones and Pinyin, and more precisely, we're going to talk about how to focus on tones when you're reading Chinese without being distracted by Pinyin. And this requires a little bit of explanation. For some of you, it might be obvious how Pinyin is distracting and why that's a bad thing, but this might still be new to some of you, so let's go through that before we look at two methods of including tone information when presenting Chinese characters without using Pinyin. So let's start by discussing how Chinese reading practice is presented to beginners. And here beginner can really mean two things. It could mean that we are adults trying to learn Chinese, as I think most people listening to this podcast are, but it could also be native speakers who just haven't had time to learn to read characters yet. These students are usually presented with similar reading content, and of course there are many adult learners who use children's books to learn to read Chinese as well, but the situations are actually very different. When a child learns Chinese characters, well, they might learn some characters before they even get to school, some maybe even learn a lot, but they're certainly not literate, and most of the Chinese they learn, most of the written Chinese is done in school, and this is something that they do after learning the spoken language. So a 7-year-old, for example, obviously don't know many characters, or most don't, but they do have a very good grasp of the spoken language. So they know all these words that they are learning in class in spoken Chinese, they just don't know how to write them down. The problem for foreign adults learning Chinese is usually the opposite. We use Pinyin to tell us how a character is pronounced. So we learn the character, we learn how it is pronounced. Whereas for a kid learning the language growing up, they know the word in the spoken language, they just need to bridge the two. So Pinyin here is used as a bridge from spoken to written or from written to spoken language. And of course, in a perfect world, I think many adults should actually learn Chinese this way too, i.e. we learn to speak and listen first, and then we learn to write characters. And this is something we did discuss in episode 1 of the podcast, so check that out if you're interested. But sadly, this is not the world we live in, so most adults actually use Pinyin in the opposite direction. They use Pinyin to figure out how a character is pronounced. This is something that native speakers obviously also do for rarer characters later when they encounter something they don't know, but they still have the word, usually at least, in their spoken vocabulary before. Having a text with both Pinyin and characters is also very different for adult foreigners and native-speaking kids, because we are extremely familiar with the Latin alphabet. We have read it and used it growing up, and it doesn't matter if your native language is Spanish, English, or Swedish here, we're still extremely familiar with these letters. That is not true, of course, for Chinese characters. They are new to us. So what happens when you read a text that includes both, for example, when you have Pinyin above the characters, is that 99% of students will only read the Pinyin, or some people might occasionally read both, but it's very, very difficult to read only the characters as a beginner when you have the familiar, friendly-looking Latin letters on top of them. This is not a problem for native speakers when they grow up, because for them, when they go to school, they need to learn the alphabet just like we did, and for them the Latin letters are also alien, whereas the characters, they appear all around them everywhere, and they are obviously the real written language, not the Pinyin. You can also see that some really early picture books for kids actually only includes characters sometimes, so there's no Pinyin. So why is this a problem for foreigners learning Chinese then? Well, it's rather obvious. If you want to learn to read Chinese, you need to practice by reading Chinese. And Chinese here refers to Chinese characters. So if you want to learn that, you have to read characters. And if you spend all your time looking at Pinyin, you will simply not develop reading ability in characters. That should be very obvious. I don't need to go into details here exactly what processes are involved. But I think it's easy to see that if you are going to learn something and you practice something else, you will not learn that first thing that you actually wanted to learn. It used to be the case that having Pinyin was essential. I remember, for example, when I started learning Chinese, I didn't have a smartphone, there were no very good electronic dictionaries and so on. We used a textbook that didn't have Pinyin for the example sentences, and these example sentences also included words that weren't covered in that chapter. And we spent hours going through these example sentences simply to figure out what they meant. because looking up these characters without having the pinyin was very slow. The point is that we didn't learn much from this experience. Oh, well, we did learn how to look up characters in a dictionary, but that is a skill that is largely obsolete these days, and you could argue that it's largely useless. What we actually needed to do back then was to read. And we didn't read because we spent an hour looking up the example sentences for each chapter. That hour should of course have been used on reading more text. Now, this problem isn't as serious these days as it were 15 years ago when I started learning Chinese, or as it were 30 years ago, long before I started learning. It's much easier to look something up these days, even if you are reading something on paper. And of course, if you're reading digitally, which you really should, there are many ways of looking up what something means, how it is pronounced, and so on. That only takes a second. Still, note that the reason Pinyin was useful in these cases is that it was a key to finding out information about the characters. If you can do that by tapping something, you simply don't need Pinyin, and also the main disadvantage with having Pinyin, namely that it distracts from reading the characters, is still very much a problem. The obvious solution to this is simply to remove the Pinyin, right? That would make everything very easy. But there are some things that you maybe don't want to throw out, and one such thing is information about tones. Because many foreigners, when learning Chinese, myself included when I was a beginner, tend to not focus enough on tones. So if you remove the pinyin, you don't know really what tones a certain word is supposed to have, and rather than looking everything up, which still takes some time even if you have a pop-up dictionary, simply isn't very practical. So if you want a way of focusing on tones, or at least be mindful of tones, read Chinese at the same time, without being distracted by pinyin, what should you do? Well, I said in the introduction that I would show 2 ways of doing this, but there are actually 3, and one of them is simply not using pinyin, but using something like zhuyin instead, because that's another way of writing down the sounds, and since it doesn't use the Latin alphabet, it's harder to read, and you need to learn to read those symbols just as you need to learn to read the characters, and since you haven't grown up doing this, you will not be distracted by them to the same extent. That's not one of the 2 solutions that I actually wanted to propose though, because for most people this is a little bit too radical. I have 2 ways of showing tones while removing pinyin, which are effective and very easy to implement. The first method is to use colors to represent tones, and this is something we talked about extensively in episode 34 of the podcast. And this means simply that you use a certain color scheme to color the characters in a certain way that lets you know what tone is which. So for example, you can use red for the first tone, blue for the 4th tone, and so on. And then you get a colorful text you can read, and you don't need any pinyin because if you know the color scheme, you know what tone each character is supposed to have. As an individual student, I think you should try this out and see if it works for you. There are of course many different color schemes around, so I strongly suggest you pick one of them and always use that. For this to work, you need to be really sure which color represents which tone. You cannot have several systems and need to think about which is which. This is also the reason why I don't suggest that you do this as a teacher, and beyond the fact that your students might have learned different color schemes, or simply think that your color scheme is very unintuitive or something like that, it's also the case, of course, that some students simply don't see the colors the way you do, and that will make it hard. Still, I think using colors is rather elegant. It's a nice way to include more information in the text without actually claiming more space. So compare with, say, including pinyin or zhuyin, that actually takes up a lot of space, whereas this is just exactly the same text, everything is the same, except that you have colored the characters. Naturally, I can't show you what this looks like in the podcast, but if you head over to the article on Hacking Chinese, I have shown examples with this and the other ways of including tones without pinyin. I also include links to tools that can create such texts for you. Obviously, I don't propose that you go in and manually color your text. That would take forever and be rather useless. That's not how you learn Chinese either. But there are other people who have developed tools that can color characters for you and make sure that it looks neat. Okay, so if coloring characters isn't the best solution then, or at least isn't the best solution in most cases, is there a better alternative? And yes, I think there is. I think including tone marks only is a very good option here. It has the same advantages as using color, i.e. that we can show the tones without being distracted by pinyin, but it doesn't take up a lot of real estate, and it's still very clear. It isn't dependent on color vision, various color schemes, and so on. Again, I have examples of this on Hacking Chinese, and of course there are tools to do this these days where you can just add tone marks only on the top of characters. To explain what this looks like, it's simply the same as adding pinyin on top of characters, except you don't add the initial and the final, you only add the tone mark. This works because now you have to read the characters because, well, you only have information about the tones above the characters, and to be able to read, obviously you need to parse the characters properly. If you need to, you can still look at the tone mark if you're unsure of what tone a certain character has, and then you can get your pronunciation right without having to look it up. It's worth pointing out here that there are many different kinds of tone problems that you might have as a student, which is something I did talk about in a separate article, which hasn't made its way to the podcast yet, but I'll put a link in the description. But one of these problems with tones is simply to not remember the correct tone. So you might be able to say it, it's just that you can't recall which tones this particular word has. And this is rather bad when you are reading aloud, for example, because you really want to reinforce the correct tones here. Reading aloud is hard as it is, so being unsure of what you're supposed to say is rarely a good idea. Now, ideally, I think people should actually learn the right tones of words simply by listening a lot, because then after a while you can hear that it's not the right tones. You know that 老师 is supposed to sound like that and not like 老师. And that's something you build up by listening over and over and hearing these words used. But sadly, again, this is not how most people learn Mandarin, and so there is need for a method to include information about the tones without adding pinyin. So there you have it. If you want to learn to read Chinese, you need to practice reading Chinese, and that means reading Chinese characters. If you include pinyin, you will probably not read as many characters as you would if you didn't include pinyin. But then again, if you remove pinyin entirely, maybe you are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So what I've proposed here are several ways of not doing that. So you include information about the tones while also getting rid of the pesky pinyin. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.